Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on interpersonal neurobiology. I have followed the course on interpersonal neurobiology a few months ago, and I was really taken by the understandings that I gained about how our body and mind works and the connections with reconstructives as a therapeutical approach that I was inspired to share some of the findings from this course with you, because after all, we are souls embodied in a human body, right? So one way or another, our soul decided to be part of this human experience, because that human touch to that experience allows us to make the lessons that we need as a soul to keep on evolving. So I will be sharing a few highlights from the course in the first phase of this presentation in terms of how to understand the human mind. And then I will go into a bit more detail of some of the areas of integration that Dan Siegel, man behind interpersonal neurobiology, identifies, and how they connect with reconstructives as a therapeutical approach. So interpersonal neurobiology is a consilient interdisciplinary framework. That means that it tries to bring the essence of different disciplines together in one way, a frame to look at reality to help us understand our life. So he builds on neuroscience, he builds on biology, anthropology, psychology, physics, quantum physics, chemistry, and so on and so on. So it's basically a very nice approach with which I personally identify, because it's bringing dots together from different perspectives and talking about how can we use then that essence to better understand our life and the reality in which we live. The man behind this framework is Dr. Dan Siegel. He's a clinical professor at UCLA, and he directs there also a research center about mindful awareness. And he's also the director of Mindsight Institute, which is a non-university related institute that seeks to promote and offers the training, for example, that I followed. He has also written lots of books, so I warmly recommend, if this topic interests you, to listen and read to his talks and his books. Now, interpersonal neurobiology states that the triangle of human experience, our human experience is based on three corners of this triangle. It is, on the one hand, the embodied brain that we have. I mean, it's an organ of our body. We are a living body with organs, and the brain is a key element of it, but it's not separated from this living body that we inhabit. It is also the relations that we have, not just with other people, but also with animals or with nature, with the surroundings, right? And finally, our experience here on this planet is also shaped by our mind. And that is why it's not just neurobiology, but it's interpersonal neurobiology, because it's about what happens within an individual, but also in between individuals and their surroundings, whether they're human, animal, or nature. So let us dive in a bit more deeply into each of those three aspects of the human experience to better understand from that perspective that I would like to share, how do we function as human beings. So let us start with the embodied brain. The brain that we have has about, give or take, 100 billion neurons. That's quite a lot. And then each neuron is able to create connections with other neurons. They're called synaptic connections, up to 10,000 of those connections. And so that means that in our brain has the potential to have 100 billion times 10,000 synaptic connections. Each connection enables an electrochemical flow of energy. What does that mean? It means that we as human beings we receive vibrations, right? Through our senses, we're able to take in those vibrations, we receive them. And so, for example, from the skin or from the eyes or from the nose, there is an electric signal that is being sent to the brain, activating a series of neurons connected with that signal, who in turn send a flow of energy to other neurons through those synaptic connections. This flow of energy is electrical and chemical because it generates a new electrical stimulus from those other neurons to other parts of the body who should react. For example, I see a lion, and so through my eyes I receive the light particles. They activate in my brain the neurons that are associated with the concept of lion. They then connect with other neurons that say danger, and as a response, my body receives the electrical signal that it has to run. And so all the body parts that are involved in running start moving. And at the same time, there is a chemical reaction because our body starts to release more adrenaline so that we have even more capacity to run faster and survive the lion. Now, patterns of this energy flow, when these connections start to form patterns, then basically what we have is energy in formation, put differently, information. And so information in our brain is nothing else but patterns of energy flow between neurons. Finally, it's important to talk about neuroplasticity, because you could say, oh, these connections are formed in my brain, they will determine my behavior for the rest of my life. And fortunately, this is not the case. Research has clearly established that you can create new neuronal connections, and you can disconnect previous connections and create new ones. So this means that your current and future behavior need not be conditioned by your previous experiences. So the fact that, let's take another example, the snake. You were afraid all your life of snakes, doesn't mean that you have to continue being afraid of snakes for the rest of your life. You can create new experiences in which you come to understand that a snake is not necessarily dangerous. It can also be friendly, or it can be admirable, right? And so these new experiences will create new neuronal connections. Thereby, next time you see a snake, you will not necessarily start to panic, but you might have a different reaction to your encounter with the snake. The second component of the human experience are relations. Like I said, relations with other humans, but could also be with animals, could be with nature, with our surroundings. Relations defined, building on the previous slides information, relations are a sharing of energy and information flow. When we have patterns, and just like patterns of energy flow became information, when we have patterns of energy and information flow, we end up with behavior. And it's how do we behave? How do we interact with our surroundings? Interestingly, you probably heard and seen the science behind it, but it's always good to remind that relationships, the quality of our relationships, are scientifically proven to be a predictor of our happiness, of longevity, of our physical and our mental health. So it's an important dynamic that we should not leave aside when we try to improve the human experience. Relationships are a fundamental part of it. It's not just about rewiring the brain, it's also about improving these relationships. And what are some key elements of healthy integrated relations? Well, there are four dimensions to a healthy integrated relation. And that is a relation in which you feel seen, soothed, safe, and secure. These are 4 characteristics that will determine the extent to which you experience a relationship as healthy, as integrated or not. How can we cultivate such a relationship? There's a very interesting acronym part that was shared during the course. And it connects with how our brain and our mind responds gradually to an interaction that takes place in a relationship. First of all, there needs to be presence. If we are talking and you are on the phone, you're not present and we cannot establish a connection. Yeah. So the presence is the basic condition without which you cannot establish a healthy relationship. Once you are present, you can attune to the other person. And this is where the mirror neurons that we have in our brain start to play a role. The mirror neurons are those neurons that make you yawn when someone else is yawning. And you somehow, without you wanting to yawn, all of a sudden you have that desire to yawn. So when we attune to the other person, we are able to generate empathy, right? We're able to understand what is going on in the other person. So we are present, we are able to understand the vibration of the other person, and then we can take it to the next step and we can resonate with it. We can generate compassion, so to say, because when we resonate, we go beyond empathy. We go beyond just feeling what the other person feels. But from recognizing that vibration, I can start to add a new dimension and I can try to bring new energy and information to this relationship that can improve or elevate the vibration of the other person. So that's when we resonate. It's like music, different instruments playing together. First, you have to find the right tune, and that's what happens at the beginning. Before they start to play together, you have to find the right tune for each instrument. They have to play the same C minor, for example. And then, when they start playing together, something can happen. They can start to resonate with one another, and all of a sudden, something magical happens. A deeper layer comes to the surface. And that's when, in human relationships or in human-animal relationships, we enter in a stage of trust. When we can trust each other, that's when we speak of a healthy integrated relationship. Moving on to the third pillar, and probably the most elusive of the 3, is the mind. Very simply said, the mind is the software of our body. It's like the pilot driving the car or driving the plane. Mental activity is anything that occurs in the mind, whether they are emotions, it's a state of mind, thoughts, it's our ability to solve problems, narrative, memory, consciousness, the subjective experience as a whole. All that is considered to be a mental activity. The mind emerges from the energy and information flow that occurs in our brain and that occurs in our relationships. So interesting, it emerges. It is not something out there. It is something that goes with the flow, so to say. It is also a complex system. And a complex system has 4 important characteristics. It is able to process information, and the mind, all that information flow that occurs in our brain, our mind is that part of us that allows us to digest that information, to do something with it, to solve a problem, for example. It is also that aspect of being aware, of consciousness. You're aware that you are thinking. So it's in a way a meta thinking, if you want. It is that subjective experience as well. That is, even though the mind, it also refers to the in-between, no one has the same experience as you do. there is a part of your human experience that is completely unique to you, even though you're connected with others. And finally, the mind is also self-organizing. It has the ability to structure itself continuously in new forms and shapes and attitudes. So when we look at mental well-being then, building further on this understanding, we have to understand that the mind is a process that not only emerges and is self-organized, it is also embodied. It's part of that bodily experience that each and every one of us has. It is relational. It has to do with the relations also of this body with others. And it is recursive. Recursive is, so it means that in a way it's continuously evolving based on the current experience and on changing conditions. The best example to give is perhaps that of a cloud. Even though we know how the cloud is composed physically and chemically, a cloud is continuously changing shape based on the different conditions in which it finds itself. And you cannot predict it. Yeah? A cloud changes simply because it adapts, it flows, it goes with the flow, right? So that is that notion of recursive. And so this process regulates the energy and information flow. And this is the part where the mind is also able to influence the connections we make, for example, in our brain, or how we engage in relations. Here, we borrow from mathematics to understand that complex systems, when they are not optimally organized, the symptom that such a system will represent is either chaos or rigidity. And here, so Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist, and with his team, he investigated the psychiatry dictionary of all possible mental afflictions that have been diagnosed so far. And he asked his team, please find a symptom that is not a representation of either chaos, rigidity, or both. And it turns out that indeed all mental afflictions can be reduced to either referring to a state of chaos, rigidity, or both. Which brings us to the concept of harmony. What is a complex system that is optimally self-organizing? It is flexible, adaptive, coherent, energizing, and stable. That is the definition from interpersonal neurobiology of the state of harmony, integration. An integrated mind is flexible, right? It does not think only in one way. It can engage with a situation in different ways. It can also adapt. It can change its response to a situation depending on that very situation. It is coherent. Over the course of time, my behavior is not radically changing. For example, when we see each other, first I give you a big hug, and 2 minutes later I punch you without an obvious reason. That kind of behavior is not coherent, right? Or I start to panic. That's maybe a better example. At first I give you a hug, and then all of a sudden I start to panic because of your presence. And that's an example of incoherent, an incoherent mind. It is energizing. It gives us energy, right? When our mind is integrated, we feel we can do a lot more because we see a lot more possibilities, and we have the resources, the inner resources to engage with those possibilities. And it is stable. It's like a rock, a big rock. No matter how much wind or rain falls on it, it stays there, firm like a rock. And so we're not so easily shaken by external circumstances. Moving on to another part of mental activity, the emotions, is also very intrinsic part of the human experience. An emotion, as we have already learned, is energy in motion, motion, energy in motion. Taking this, applying this to the concept of mind, it means it is, when energy is in motion, that means that something is happening in that self-organizing system, which generates a shift in integration of the mind. So that means that an emotion can bring us from an integrated, harmonious state of mind into a state of chaos or rigidity. It might be that because of a message you receive, this generates an emotion in you. You are feeling perfectly happy and peaceful, and all of a sudden you're reminded of a conflict with a partner of you, and you enter in a state of rigidity. You freeze. You don't know what to do. You start to boil. All of a sudden your mind races in all different directions. Now, this doesn't have to mean that you end up with a mental affliction. No, it is very normal for an integrated mind to shift, to fluctuate between states of harmony and states of chaos and rigidity. What makes the difference is that an integrated mind is able to make sense of emotions, which allows the mind to come back to a state of integration. When we are not able to make sense of our emotions, that's when we end up lost in a state of chaos or rigidity. So that ability to deal with emotions is referred to as the window of tolerance. And this can be wide or narrow, depending on our hot buttons. The hot buttons refers to, on the one hand, our history, everything that we have gone through, all our reactions, emotional reactions to situations that occurred, will determine to a certain extent how we react now, but also the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Because maybe we perceive sensations that used to make us very angry, but now I am in a stable relationship, I'm surrounded by a group of friends, and I receive the same stimuli, but I don't feel the need to react angry because I am in a different surrounding. I feel safe, I feel soothed, I feel secure, I feel seen. What is then the therapeutic approach to chaos and rigidity as proposed by interpersonal neurobiology? It is, on the one hand, to stabilize the capacity to monitor, to observe what is going on. What are these flows of energy and information that are occurring in my body? And how is my mind reacting to them? And the second aspect is to modify our consciousness and behavior towards differentiating and linking. And that is one of the fundamental definitions of integration that interpersonal neurobiology offers. Integration means that you're able to differentiate between different aspects and you're able to link them. At the level of our brain, this happens through the connectome. The connectome is refers to the degree of connections that there are between all the different parts of our brain, not only left and right hemispheres, but also the limbic area, the cortex, and so on. So the more connections there are, the more integrated your brain, the healthier you are. And put differently, when they did the research, they found that people who are healthy, who feel well, they have more connections in their brain than people who are physically or mentally in a state of chaos or rigidity. Connecting this to reconstructives, that first aspect, to stabilize the capacity to monitor, that's in a way what we do when we deconstruct the minds of the people in a workshop. Because we need to open their mind. We need to allow them, we need to give them the understanding that there is a different way of looking at a history that they have only looked at from one perspective. This is stabilization of the ability to observe an event more neutrally, more objectively. And then in the reconstructive movement, what we do is we physically and mentally allow participants to experience an issue, a topic in their lives from that very perspective of that topic. And by forcing in that way that lived experience from that completely different perspective, our participants are then able to appreciate the differences in perspectives, the different positions, the richness of those differences, and then make connections. Where previously I interpreted my parents' behavior from my own inner child perspective, all of a sudden I'm able to understand my parents' perspective. And I'm able to understand that we didn't have to be on the same line. It is okay to have different perspectives. And in fact, if we are able to make connections between those perspectives, a whole new reality opens up. We no longer face obstacles on our path. We see possibilities. We see new projects. We see new energy that emerges in us. So to conclude this first part, which presented the general frame of interpersonal neurobiology, 7 tips for well-being, mental, physical well-being. Important to foresee time not to do anything, downtime, right? Not meditating, not sleeping, just simply being, allowing whatever emerges to emerge. Sleep time, it's important that our body gets rest. And also time in, right? Time in means time for introspection, meditation. Then when we engage with the outside world, important to have focus time. That is, if you work on something, try to be as concentrated as possible on that task, because that will give you more satisfaction and you will be more productive. Physical time, it's important to exercise, to keep that body moving. It's important also to have playtime. It doesn't always have to be serious. It's good to play. It activates also new possibilities. You get to see new perspective. You see things from a different perspective. And finally, connecting time. Very important to have in your day as well some time to connect with nature, with others, with animals. That will increase your state of well-being. Okay, so far, the general frame. Now we're moving to the second part that I wanted to share with you. Interpersonal neurobiology identifies 9 domains of integration. And remember, integration is that state of being able to differentiate and link so that we do not feel chaotic or rigid, but instead harmonious. We're energized, we're coherent, we're flexible, we're adaptive, and we're stable. So I will not go into detail of each of those domains. I would like to highlight just a few that when I listened to the explanations and the understanding as presented by Dan Siegel, rang a lot of bells regarding the work that we do in Reconstructives. The first one, and probably one of the most fundamental graphs underpinning interpersonal neurobiology and our reality at large, is this plane, this graph that we see, which is not a typical graph. It has 3 axes and a lot of different shapes. So let me explain this. First of all, the basic starting point here is quantum physics and how quantum physics understand the world. As you know, there is a difference between the world of classical Newtonian physics in which we live, where everything is predictable, and once we go down to a level, to the micro level of the smallest element of a quantum, we see that no longer are there predictions, but only possibilities. So that is what is drawn at the bottom of this graph, the gray surface between time diversity and probability, when we look at that microstate of the quantums, everything is possible. That's why quantum physicists call this the plane of possibilities, or the sea of possibilities. However, if we look at us as human beings, we're of course, even though we are built up of quantums, these quantums have found a way together of expressing themselves because of the parents that gave birth to us, the geographical context in which we grew up, the socio-economical context in which we grew up, and so on and so forth. And so we have our history that shapes, in a way, how we are able to live our reality. I am not able to experience life as a poor, black person, woman, yeah, because I'm a male, middle-class man, right? So my experience of reality and understanding of reality is radically different from that of a poor black African woman, for example, right? Because we come from different backgrounds and we have a different history, and our body is simply also inducing us to live different experiences. So that means that we do not find ourselves on that plane of possibilities. We are somewhere higher in that plane because of all that history that we have. And then it's depending on how high towards the actual materialization of reality we find ourselves, that we are able to have certain thoughts, emotions, and memory. So the state of mind is like a plateau, which is not fixed. It can go up or it can go down. When it goes up, typically we are in a state of rigidity or chaos because we're only able to see reality from one perspective. If it is lower, we're able to see a lot of possibilities. We're aware that a lot more exist. How does this connect? This notion of consciousness, as understood from the lens of quantum physics, to what we do in Reconstructives. That plane of possibilities is what we refer to as Akasha. In Oriental, especially in the Vedic tradition, Akasha is the fifth element that encompasses all other four elements and is exactly that embodiment of possibility. It is the notion of space that is not empty, but full of possibilities. Space waits for an intention, for prana, for a purpose to become matter, right? So that is the notion of Akasha. The state of mind is what we have referred to in our trainings as the morphing fields. Once we think something, it's difficult not to think it anymore. And interestingly, and this is the quantum dimension to it, even though seemingly we are disconnected, when I make a new understanding or I learn something new, it connects on a quantic level with the field of my peers who also then have learned this. It doesn't mean that they're aware of it, but they also learn it. And so that's the typical case there of groups of sparrows on two different continents, where on one continent they learn something new, and all of a sudden, without there being an objective reason for that other group of sparrows in a different continent to learn that, researchers witnessed that they had the same behavior as the first group. So that's what happens when, and this is the third element, which is very important, it's that notion of intention, of purpose. That is why it is so important when we put the participants in that group of four with their specific roles. It's an intention, it's giving direction on a quantum level to limit from all the possible possibilities there exist. How should that energy manifest itself? It is through the roles that are assigned adding to which you have the topic about which you are going to work. So the topic of the client who works in reconstructive exercise gives an elevation to that state of mind, and it creates that morphic field between the participants that allows them to resonate, and that gives rise to that experience exactly where, you know, people say, I didn't share my history, but the other participants were so in tune with my history, it was as if they knew it. How is that possible, right? This is the explanation, because there is that connection with the quantic field and with that plane of possibilities. And thanks to the roles and the intention, a morphic field is created between those participants. And it's something that goes beyond classical physical reason. Secondly, we have bilateral integration. And bilateral integration refers to the integration between the two hemispheres. It's important to clarify that there is no such thing as a left-only hemisphere mental activity or a right-only mental sphere activity. Both spheres are always connected. However, there may be a dominance of activity in one or the other hemisphere. When we see suboptimal integration of the mind, for example, in the case of avoidant attachment, and the fact that you are not able to establish relations with someone else because you are afraid that that other person will break your trust or will hurt you. So you prefer not to engage from the beginning, and that's avoidant attachment. Typically, what happens in the brain is a left mode dominance, which means dominance of language, logic, literal interpretations, linear thinking, list making. A very representative thought pattern of people who have this avoidant attachment is, I cannot integrate all the feelings that I'm feeling because I have the feeling that no one protects me. And this is what happened when they were an infant, right? They had the feeling that their parents were not there to protect them. And so instead of thinking that their parents are crazy, the child, the infant, will create a survival mechanism whereby it protects itself by not feeling. And that is why in its day-to-day behavior, it kind of eliminated a right mode dominant engagement with life, focusing on the left mode instead. And I found it very interesting because for these people, participating in Reconstructives is magical because we leave out language of the exercise, right? So we leave out the left mode and we really invite the participants to experience something completely different. And by experiencing it and realizing that nothing bad happens, they are still alive. They are contained in that space, in that exercise. You create a possibility of a radical new life experience for them. An experience that will allow them to work and grow towards a more integrated life. Moving on to vertical integration. Vertical integration refers to the connection between bodily organs and the cerebral cortex. Here we have that interesting movie, short video clip that we also use in our trainings, where a parent says no to the daughter. Neurologically, biologically, what happens in our mind is that when we hear a yes, our social engagement system is activated. Right? That means that we're willing to engage, we're opening ourselves up. A no, biologically, neurologically speaking, shuts us down in a way. It activates in the subcortex the 4F response. fight, flight, freeze, or faint. So these kind of reactions are a symptom of absence of vertical integration, yeah? An absence of integrating bodily sensations with the sense that we give to our emotions, with our thinking patterns, and how we engage socially. So that is vertical integration, and it's very clear that we work on these dimensions also in Reconstructives. We try to reduce the thinking part so that a new experience can make space to integrate bodily sensations, emotions, and our social connections. Another area that is very interesting is that of memory integration. Important to know that there are two types of memory, broadly speaking, implicit and explicit memory. And of course, there are different subcategories, but two main types of memory are implicit and explicit. The explicit is not so much the issue here. It's the implicit one, which offers a lot of interesting connections with the work that we do. Because implicit memory is that memory that is integrated in our body unconsciously. It doesn't require a conscious mind to integrate, to make these kind of memories. How does the body store it? Well, it's stored through bodily sensations, emotions, perception, and behavior. And here I just want to share, again, we are a human body. That means that we are subject to biology. And how does the body store emotions? How does it store memory in its cells? It's through the simple process of breathing. Because when we breathe in O2, it goes into the blood, where the process of cellular respiration generates new connections. It generates a chemical process whereby sugar that we have from the food that we eat connects with the O2 to create CO2, which is what leaves the lungs as we breathe out, into water. Remember, the human body is 70% water, so water is actually the structure of the human body. And the whole structure of the human body, cell structure, is connected to water. So it converts in the air we breathe in, the vibrations we receive, convert into water that goes into our bodily structure, and that is how implicit memory is also embodied. And it releases in the process the energy that was stored in the food that we eat through the absorption of the energy of the sun and converting it with water into sugar. And so that energy that is being released allows us to engage in the activities that we do. Right? Just as a side note on to better understand, why do emotions or vibrations, sensations, how are they stored implicitly in our body? Another element or another process that explains this is epigenetics. Also there, for example, even when you're still in the womb of your mother, it has been scientifically proven that mental reactions of the mother are transmitted to the child and as epigenetical codings that then are, when activated when the child is born, produce the same kind of response in the child as in the mother. Interestingly, when we retrieve implicit memory, it does not feel as if it comes from the past. Technically speaking, the term is absence of ekphory. Ekphory is when you are able to willfully activate a memory in your mind. So when we retrieve implicit memory, we don't know where it comes from. It is as if it comes out of nowhere. We have no specific association with a past event. However, the moment we retrieve it, it enters into consciousness. Yeah? It means that we become aware of it and we are able to make sense, we are able to transform this flow of energy and information in ourselves. Narrative integration. Narrative integration is about how we connect our physical side, the observation of external events, happenings, with our mind side, the ability of our mind to shape feelings, thoughts, memories, perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, intentions, desires, longing. It's in a way the inner landscape of our mind. When these two are coherent, they are integrated. Here I wanted to make an interesting reference to stories, because narrative integration is about stories. Is what is the story that I create to connect physical events with mental events? Stories arise especially when something happens that violates our expectation, when something occurs that we did not expect, and then we have to make sense of this, right? The process of making sense and capturing this as a story that is then stored as a lesson for future reference in our mind, it increases our survival. It increases our ability to adapt to circumstances that violate our expectations. So this takes place at an individual level. When this takes place at a collective level, what we end up with is culture. Culture is nothing else but the collective survival stories of a group of people. Collectively, they have gone through experiences, events that violated their expectations of what it was necessary to be safe, to be secure. They made sense of it in order to increase their probability of survival. And this is, of course, one of the things that we work with, one of the programs that we seek to address through Reconstructives is the cultural program. Then we have temporal integration. So I already gave a bit of reference to the difference between the classical physics that take place at macro state. The implication thereof is that time has a direction. There is a past, a present, and a future in that macro state. However, at the quantum level, there is no time. Time has no direction, right? There's only possibilities. Connecting to this is the non-locality principle captured in the term entanglement, through which apparently separated elements turn out to be fundamentally interconnected. It's the example of the morphing fields. For no objective classical reasoning, two elements are supposed to interact. However, when they are separated and you invert, for example, the polarity of those elements at exactly the same time that you invert the polarity of one quantum here, its partner, miles apart, goes through the same inversion. There is no classical physical explanation for this, because this happens faster than the speed of light. Yeah. That's the notion of entanglement. Now, why is it important mentioning this? Because our mind, we have said, is an emergent property of energy. It emerges from the flow of energy and information that takes place in our brain. Now, if energy is entangled, is non-local, then that means that also the mind is non-local. And that helps to explain why it is possible, even, and I think we have all participated or done those exercises ourselves, even if you're about to start a reconstructive exercise and you end up shifting one person who was already taking his place with someone else, it still works. It still works because the change takes place on a quantum level. Yeah? And the alignment in that morphic field takes place instantly. Finally, a word about the identity integration. And I found this very interesting to better understand where the program of our family comes from, how it is composed. Again, we are human beings, biological beings, and that means that we have, on the one hand, we're composed of DNA, which is the genes that have survived generation after generation. And on the other hand, it's the epigenetics, it's the cells that are around the genes that determine how these genes are then expressed. Epigenetics is a reflection of how generation after generation we have adapted to the circumstances in which the genes have materialized as human beings. So those two combined, they form the temperament that we have. The temperament is not connected to a lived experience. It's how our body is predetermined to respond to certain stimuli. However, it's not the whole picture. We also have attachment experiences. Attachment experiences refer to how, as an infant, newly born, my parents respond to my needs, my expression of needs. And that will determine how I will relate to the outside world when I grow up, based on how my parents engage with me as an infant. So those two, and I mean, the course goes a lot more into detail about attachment as such, because it's a very interesting area, but it's not that relevant now here to connect it to reconstructives. So attachment and temperament determine our personality, our individual identity, both that biological origin that is part of us and our lived social relational experiences will shape who we end up being as a person. This is then connected to the family group identity, because we have identity on the level of the individual, but also on the level of a group. And in this case, it's the group of the family. What does the family identify with? What are the norms? What is accepted behavior? And so my individual identity, together with my group identity, will shape the family program that we are working with in Reconstructives. Okay, well, so that's it from my side. I mean, those were like some of the main insights I wanted to share with you. I hope you found it interesting to hear how, from that neurobiological perspective, the processes that we invite our participants to go through, how they take place, and perhaps they can help you also in framing or explaining some of the experiences as they have. Thank you for tuning in, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Have a nice day.